presentation is titled How a Biometric Identity Can Be the Basis of a World-Class Cyber-Physical Security Strategy. Our speaker is the founder and managing director of Daltrey, a unique security solution that delivers biometrics as a service for workforce authentication across all physical and digital access scenarios. As a biometrics and identity management specialist with extensive experience helping global organizations solve their most pressing cybersecurity risk and compliance challenges, Blair Crawford is an industry thought leader, regular guest speaker, and the host of industry podcast Identity Today. Please welcome Blair Crawford, founder and managing director of Daltrey. Over to you, Blair.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be part of a conference like this. I think one of the interesting things is that I don't really know who I'm talking to right now. And the truth is that most people will default to truth when I say that I am Blair Crawford. Now that's okay for this interaction, but I think when we consider not really knowing or having absolute certainty around the identity of the people we're interacting with when it comes to business, and when it comes to interacting with business systems more specifically, and the assets which we have in our ecosystem, then it becomes much more important to understand the identity piece. And that's what we do when we talk about biometrics. We've entered a new era where cyber attacks pose it's almost like an existential threat that can cripple the machinery of our society and our ability to actually protect national sovereignty. And one of the most significant weaknesses that we see is inferior credential issuance and authentication practices. And then within there, you've got inherently vulnerable access cards and passwords as part of that consideration. So I think what I want to start today is, as a technology, biometrics offers elite performance when it comes to false accepts, and also doing things like liveness detection, making sure the person interacting with a particular service is in fact there to protect us against, for example, presentation attacks. The actual biometric market has become significantly more mature in the last 5 years. We can provide high levels of assurance when it comes to authentication in large workforce or citizen identity scenarios. But I think critically, and right now, given the current cyber physical landscape, our end-to-end treatment of biometrics and also holistic approach to identity strategy needs to be considered across the overall workflow in order to truly be able to use biometrics properly. And when we get that whole process right, the technology can be a foundational element of security and risk strategy. It can protect users' data, and it can also protect their sensitive information and locations. So we'll discuss that in more detail now. So one of the things that we've seen in market as a recurring theme, not just over the period of the pandemic, but more so over the last 18 to 24 months, is the problem with inconsistent identity establishment and credential issuance practices. So the question is, why is it that when we onboard a new user into our ecosystem of applications or locations, that we're not tightly tying that identity establishment to the issuance of the credential, which will ultimately give that person access to our systems or locations? And I think the other thing that we're seeing is that there is a much required need to actually converge the physical and digital identity authentication methods. Question, why is it that we go in through a front door with one credential, and then when we sit down in front of our business applications, we actually use a different credential? All disconnected systems, siloed approach to logical and physical access management, and not a single approach to identity management. And I think that last point there is the most significant. If we look at large organizations, there seem to be so many opportunities to actually create identities, whether it's in the physical access control system the logical access control system, the privileged access management system, just straight out of Active Directory. And then, of course, the rogue applications that everybody has in their enterprise, where people are creating identities in departments by themselves. Is it possible to have the same credential for everything that spans the boundary independently of the application ecosystem and, in fact, the device ecosystem as well? And I think if you dig, deeper into that, I touched on it a few moments ago about the vulnerabilities or the inherent vulnerabilities of passwords. I remember working with an organization not so long ago, and they did not have the maturity in their password management system or their access management system to be able to do single sign-on. So the first thing that they wanted to do was introduce complex passwords. If I remember off the top of my head, the increase in IT support calls was 300% in a period of a month because people had added a hash or a $sign into their passwords. And then after 2 months, what we started to find were many more post-it notes and or sharing of passwords on whiteboards. So passwords are inherently flawed, and we're inherently lazy with some things. So there has to be a different approach in that regard. And the same vulnerabilities, exist with access cards. Slightly different. If you lose an access card, how quickly do you report it? So I think if we look at those inherent flaws when it comes to authentication practices, we start to uncover some of the issues that we will have around even the robustness of a role-based access control. A couple of presentations ago, we were talking about role-based access control and maturity and being able to define with certainty who had the right privileges to access the right applications or locations. But that all kind of falls apart if we can't guarantee with certainty who's actually using the credential in the first place. Another big point that the market is asking, sorry, back one slide. Another big point at the moment is it's around user privacy. It's around the security. And can we have a combination of amazing user experience, but also build in privacy and data security at the same time? So can we converge the physical and logical credentials? Can we establish with certainty who a person is before we issue them a credential? And then can we apply biometrics to sit over the top of all of that, independent of the application ecosystem and the device ecosystem? Now, if we keep all of that in mind, and we now consider the scale of the work from home situation that we all have, the notion of deperimeterization starts to come up in people's mind. Now, that's a term that was coined by Paul Simmons earlier on in the year. He's the CEO of the Global Identity Foundation. And it's the idea that access management and the perimeter of your organization, well, it's kind of been wiped out. There are no borders anymore. They've disappeared. And so have the traditional methods associated with access control to data and locations. And that's where we start to see the advent, or let's say the acceleration of the idea of a zero trust architecture. Zero trust says, trust no one, verify everything, and then provide the minimum viable permissions. So CISOs not only need to protect the front door and the back door to their data assets, but they also need to know where all the side doors are. And that becomes much more difficult when you now have the front line of corporate security in everybody's dining room or study or wherever it might be. So I think the way to get there, yes, is identity access management and privileged access management, and the less talked about physical access management. We look at those as being the tenets of information and asset security, but we have to deal with the problems that were inherent with the move to, for example, remote working. Connectivity. No one was prepared to the scale and the scope and the size of the pandemic and what that was going to do in the time that it did. Collaboration. Users still need to be able to collaborate effectively with each other, and they need to be able to do it fast. And I think they also need to still be able to provide their employees with transparency around what it is they're up to and where they're working from, when they're online, so that they can still have that feel of being working at the same time with their co-workers. So what we're starting to see now is that identity is becoming the new perimeter, is the starting point. Because I said as a moment ago, there's no point in having a robust IAM strategy if you can't guarantee that the person who's using a credential is in fact the person who we intended to use it. So when we talk about biometrics being able to provide that level of certainty, it does provide that forensic level assurance. We can wrap in technology such as liveness detection, and then we can ultimately guarantee who is accessing services. But the other part which is important from a biometric perspective is around that user experience. So I don't know if anybody's following US Cyber Week coverage. You may have seen a presentation, I think it was yesterday or the day before, from Sean Fraser. Sean is the CSO of the federal government business unit for Okta, obviously a large identity access management player for those who don't know. And he said in one of his presentations this week that user experience is the holy grail of security. And he continued to explain that if users are inconvenienced enough, they will find a means to circumvent security measures altogether. And that goes back to my point earlier on about adding on, a couple of extra digits for complex passwords, and all of a sudden you see more post-it notes, more calls to IT help desk, or just plain writing and sharing passwords on whiteboards. Then the other thing he said was that everybody has a plan around their security strategy, but just like Mike Tyson said, everyone has that plan until they get punched in the face. And of course, COVID-19 has been that cybersecurity punch in the face. So I think where we say that we have to start with identity, we also have to say, well, we have to start with the end user, because if the user experience is not positive, all your hard work at implementing access control, privileged access management, really complex context-based authentication processes, it pretty much goes out the window if people are motivated to actually create shortcuts in their experience interacting with their day-to-day business. And I think the user experience also touches on being able to remove passwords in their entirety, remove access cards in their entirety, and being able to actually reduce the laborious component of multi-factor authentication, so that users not only have an experience from an authentication perspective that flows across devices, but actually flows across applications and locations, kind of irrespective of where they are. So I think here what we want to look at is, the building blocks of an identity-defined security strategy. If you have a biometric credential as the foundational element of that. So many of these elements are going to, jump out straight away as being familiar. So if we look across the top, you've got your main areas of administration of an ID, being able to audit the transactions to see who did what, when, and where, and control that in line with your business policy, risk procedures. You've also got the actual authentication methodology itself. And then, of course, at an access management level, you've got the role-based access control to define what those authorization levels are. Now, if we forget the identity provider piece for a second, and we look at the traditional components of identity governance and administration. So you may have a product like SailPoint to sit across your IGA component of your business. You may then have a CyberArk to manage privileged access management. Those two systems in their own right can create identities. That's fine. It's usually quite tight within an organization. Where it starts to become a little bit more complicated, though, is when you go down to the next level. What we often see is multiple identity access management systems. So, for example, you may have ForgeRock, Auth0, Okta, Azure AD, all existing together within a enterprise, all managing different applications and all creating or having the ability to create user identities. You then step that down another layer to the physical access control perspective. You may have Honeywell, Gallagher, InnerRange, Siemens, over time, an organization that was small with a couple of physical locations may now have 15 locations or something like that. And every single one of those locations has a different physical access control system if they've not had the ability to procure them all together in the first place. So as that starts to become more problematic, the market is starting to say, well, how about there's another layer that sits above governance, privileged access management, identity access management, and also the physical access management piece. And if we consider the top of the illustration there, and we consider that you could have an identity provider for all workforce authentication that works irrespective of the device that a person is interacting with or the application which they're trying to get into, then it starts to become very powerful from a security, risk, and governance standpoint. So if you can't connect all of your applications in your ecosystem, and you cannot very easily have one methodology so far as applications to manage all of your single sign-in process, then how about we actually just create a standardized approach to identity that sits above all of that and then flows down through all of those touch points. And biometrics helps us with that for a couple of reasons. But before I go into that, I'll discuss a couple of other things that make that possible. Now, identity or the identity access management landscape has matured significantly, as I said, over the last number of years, over the last 2-3 years. But one of the most significant advancements has been the standardization of interfaces. Interfaces such as OIDC or OpenID Connect. That has made it possible to actually create third-party identity providers who can act as a single authentication component into disparate ecosystems of applications. The physical access world has also started to standardize its interfaces. It's probably not as mature as the approach to OIDC, but they've all moved to REST API and they've all moved to common protocols for communication. And it gives us the best opportunity when you're an IDP to actually be able to communicate there as well. Now, the significance of biometrics, when you start to look at the need for standardization and interfaces, if you look at the actual authentication point at the edge, all of the devices are different. Different manufacturers of fingerprint readers or card readers, different manufacturers of PIN code providers, different manufacturers of laptop providers, mobile phones, iOS and Android, whatever it might be. What we have to do is elevate the identity component so that you no longer have to rely on a card that has a proprietary component to it and only works with certain access management systems, for example. The ability with biometrics to just allow a user to present themselves to a device, whether it's a laptop, whether it's a fingerprint reader, whether it's an iris reader or a face reader, have that work with the identity provider's engine, and then seamlessly push an authentication token down to the various applications which exist within the ecosystem, allows that fully physical, logical convergence to happen. And that is very powerful, not just from a security audit, forensic auditability standpoint, but from a user's experience, it's extremely powerful because all of a sudden, I don't need an access card to go to any buildings. I don't need any PIN codes to get into any rooms. I don't need any passwords to authenticate into any of the applications in the life cycle of my employment. Contractors, for example, visitors, they can also be provided with role-based access control without actually having to carry an access card, and in some cases actually be escorted. And that gets to I think one of the most important parts about the value of biometrics, and it's touching on that, how when I know that I've issued someone a credential, that they're the person who's actually using that credential after it's issued. And that's coming back to that whole idea of tying the identity establishment to credential issuance. The idea here is that, and we're seeing a lot of clients move to this, Instead of having your accounts pre-provisioned for your mere independent access management platforms, the HR, or the people management software or people management area of the business, actually has much more involvement during onboarding and creating a person's credential. Not a lot of organizations are doing that. I'm talking more about the organizations we're working with who are looking at biometrics across the whole ecosystem. And what they're saying is, okay, if we're going to do a pre-employment check, if we're going to do police checks, background checks, employment verification checks, and we're also going to capture passport details, driving license details, and whatever else is appropriate, as we verify that person's ID, we should also be tying their credential to that process and then making it available to the operational areas of the business. That will increase overall risk posture, but it also starts to become very logical if you think about an employee's journey. I start my job, I speak to HR, I'm given a credential at the same time, and then my account is pre-provisioned as per the role-based access control, which is applicable to the job that I'm going to be doing for this organization. So I think if we get that right, there's a fantastic opportunity for biometrics to be deployed as a service to organizations who are looking to improve their overall position or posture, but also provide a fantastic user experience for those who, like me, just don't want to use passwords or access cards anymore. Thank you very much for listening. Try to keep this short and sweet in case anyone has any questions, which I'm open to taking to now.
That was a very informative talk there, Blair. Thank you for your time. Definitely took some notes. So because we're running slightly behind time, what we will do is we will have people put in their Q&A, questions in the Q&A box. And then Blair, if you're around, then you can provide some feedback. And obviously people can get in touch with you via LinkedIn, I assume, for any additional follow-ups. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.